How many languages does the Russian President Vladimir Putin speak? Well, let's find out in this video. So most obviously of all, he speaks Russian. This is his first language, his mother tongue, which makes sense seeing as he's the president of the Russian Federation, of which Russian is the official language. He was born in St. Petersburg in 1952. St. Petersburg was one of the cities that the Russians built in 1702. It was built by Peter the Great, who we'll come back to at the end of this video, after he conquered the area from the Swedes. This means that this area of St. Petersburg is not what's considered Old Russia, the kind of nucleus of Russia, where in linguistic terms we have various centuries old dialects of Russian that we can still trace. As a result of this, St. Petersburg falls outside of these traditional dialect areas, and so we can speak of a kind of standard Russian being spoken there. Dialects and accents aren't as big a thing in Russian. It's quite a heavily standardized language as it is, and this is certainly the case in St. Petersburg, where we have a kind of standard Russian accent that is heard there. And indeed, this is the way that Putin speaks Russian, so there's no real strong accent or dialect with which he speaks. He does, however, sometimes include what have been termed Putinisms, something named after a Bushism. These aren't really accent or dialect features, but are rather some elements of, perhaps you might call it slang, small idioms that are used by certain parts of Russian society, particularly those of the Silovik, which in Russian or Soviet society were those armed organizations of government branches that were allowed to harm other people in the society, that had a license for violence. And these expressions he uses quite frequently in his speeches, and these have been termed the Putinisms. So, quite obviously, the first language that he speaks is Russian. The second language that he speaks is because of his time in school. Now, when he was at school, the Soviet Union, most children would learn at least one other foreign language. In other Soviet republics, they would also, for most of the Soviet Union's existence, learn the native language. So in Ukraine, they might learn Ukrainian. In Kazakhstan, they might learn Kazakh. But because he was in Russia, he learned one of the foreign languages. So in his case, either English or German. Now, we know that he could speak German by the time he was a young adult, because we know that he was a KGB agent, that is the USSR's secret service. And while he was a KGB agent, we knew that from 1985 onwards, he was active in East Germany. There are various reports about what he exactly did as an agent. Some have said that he worked to rendezvous with members of the Rote Army faction, that is the Red Army faction, sometimes called the Baader-Meinhof Group, a communist guerrilla movement that operated in West Germany and sometimes sought sanctuary in East Germany. What's more likely is that he was working with the Stasi, that is the East German secret police. Both of these, however, would require a working knowledge of German, so it's quite likely that he had already learned German at school and then continued his proficiency later whilst working in the KGB. Following the end of his career in Germany, he would continue speaking German, certainly with the former Chancellor of Germany and self-professed friend Gerhard Schröder, with whom he would converse in German. He's also known to have conversed with Angela Merkel, another Chancellor of Germany, in German as well, but in official meetings would switch to Russian with interpreters, as is diplomatic practice.
Уважаемый господин президент, ich beginne trotzdem auf Russisch.
So his second language is German. Now the third language that he speaks is English. This, of course, he may have picked up in school. Once again, we don't know whether he learned English or German at school, but it's likely again that his time in the KGB, it will have been useful for him to know and understand some English, so he may have learned it. Now, this is unproven, but quite likely that 10 years before his posting to East Germany, he was posted to New Zealand. Not exactly a Cold War hotspot, but he was still a beginning agent at this time. Several New Zealand sources have suggested that he spent time around Wellington and Auckland in the North Island of New Zealand. And of course, he was living there. He must have been able to speak at least some English at that time. Also, for his time in East Germany, it will have been helpful for intercepting NATO messages and perhaps Western spies that he encountered there. If he knew some English too, this was still quite a useful language in international settings. So it's quite possibly that he will have learned English as part of his training program at the KGB. So his third language then is English, although it's not exactly the smoothest.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to greet members and guests of the General Assembly of the International Exhibitions Bureau. Russia has a long and rich experience of participation in the World Expo movement. We took part in the very first Universal Exhibition in London in 1851, and at the Paris Exhibition in 1900.
Putin isn't the only Russian leader of the past century to speak several languages, however. There is somewhat of a common myth that Nikita Khrushchev, who was born close to Ukraine, could speak Ukrainian as a result of having lived there for many years, but there is actually no evidence of this being true whatsoever. What is true, however, is that his second, sometimes suggested third wife was Ukrainian, most likely did speak Ukrainian, but that Nikita Khrushchev instead sometimes used phrases of Surzhyk, a kind of mixed Russian-Ukrainian dialect that is spoken in parts of Ukraine and was spoken in parts of the Donbass when he was there. So sometimes he would use a Ukrainian-ish expression rather than being fluent in Ukrainian. Another one I'd like to mention is the guy we talked about at the very start, Peter, the guy who founded St. Petersburg, known in Russian as Peter the Great, because he, as well as speaking Russian, also spoke Dutch, and thought that Dutch should become the second language of Russia as the most modern language in Europe at the time. And that, my friends, deserves a Wilhelmus. So in terms of the languages that Putin can speak, 2 are in the top 10 most spoken native languages in the world, English and Russian. Now German, we have to go all the way down to 19. It's the 19th most spoken native language in the world. So with how many people can Putin converse in their native language? That's 602 million people around the world, around 8%, which isn't too shabby.